Mr. John Wood, professor at the NISA Center for Strategic Studies, thank you for receiving us. We want to talk about Afghanistan today, and our first question relates to the elections that just took place April 5th. Can you talk to us about the structure of those elections a little bit, and what should we expect now that they started counting the votes?
Yeah, first of all, the elections on Saturday, April 5th in Afghanistan are a landmark event by any measure. And congratulations need to be extended to the people of Afghanistan first and foremost. Their willingness to stand up to adverse conditions, to stare down the threats of the Taliban, and to go out and vote in near record numbers is laudatory, and it's something that they should be very proud of. And frankly, that the Western contributors should be very proud of our small contributions recently and our large contributions over the course of the last 13 years that led to such an event. Secondly, I point out that the Afghans planned, executed, and supervised this election more so than any of the previous elections in Afghanistan. In fact, this election was planned and executed almost solely by the Afghans themselves. This marks a huge landmark or milestone in the political maturation of the country. And that aspect we really need to applaud the Afghans on as well. It was overwhelmingly a positive event, and it was clearly an indication that the Afghans have not given up on democracy. That in fact they've further embraced democracy and look for the opportunity to move forward. It was marked by, as we know, now 8 primary candidates, or principal candidates, and their tickets that actually contested the election on the 8th. It was a very spirited debate, a very robust democratic debate process that was put in place, and one that I think was very much embraced by the Afghan people. So now it's a matter of the mechanics of counting the votes initially at the polling stations, of then transferring the ballots in a secure way to Kabul, and then under the supervision of the Independent Electoral Commission, the final tallies of the votes, and concurrently the adjudication of any complaints by the Independent Electoral Complaints Commission. Both of these organizations have come a very long way from where they were in the 2009 election. And despite the manner in which the commissioners are appointed, I think have demonstrated over the last 6 months that they have embraced this idea of an independent role. And so the supervision of the election itself, now the adjudication of the complaints, the ferreting out of some degree of fraud, and there will be some, will be done in a transparent manner, I think in a very aggressive manner, managed by the Afghans themselves. So I think that this election, I think, is testimony to the great progress that the country has made and their willingness, in fact, their demand to move this democratic process forward. There were clearly some winners in Saturday's election, even before we've heard who the declared victor of the election itself would be. I'd say, obviously, as I've already mentioned, the people of Afghanistan are huge winners as a result of this election. They have demonstrated how much they want to protect their freedoms. I think, as I mentioned, there's a certain degree of support from the Western sponsors that this support should be seen in a very positive, put that in the winners category as well, and particularly put it there as encouragement to keep the Western involvement in the country as we move forward. Thirdly, I'd say in a very strong fashion, the women of Afghanistan were big winners. It may not be known to most of our audience, but there were 300 women as candidates for the provincial councils across the country. It's a very strong showing by the Afghan women and a very strong demonstration that the gains that they have made, they will not give up easily, and that there is a great momentum behind that. And lastly, in the winners column, I would say the Afghan National Security Forces, the degree to which they had planned, then executed the security of the election was superb. The Afghan National Security Forces, the Army and the police, have far exceeded what the expectations were about a year ago. There were some security incidents. In fact, there were probably about 110 or so fatalities on election day. But of those 110, about 90 of them were actually Taliban insurgents that had been eliminated by the security forces prior to them inflicting their damage on the polling places. Now, there was clearly a loser on Saturday as well. That's the Taliban. The Taliban went out of its way to increase violence, extremely increased violence in this run-up period. We've all been witness to the spectacular attacks, including the most recent one at the Serena Hotel in downtown Kabul, as an effort to derail the process and to put fear into the Afghan electorate. In fact, just the opposite happened. The Afghan people rose up and said that that is not what they wanted to see happen, and that they would not be intimidated by the Afghan Taliban. I think the harder the Taliban tried to derail the process, the more determined the Afghan people became. And so therefore, I say unequivocally, the Afghan Taliban were a clear and definitive loser in Saturday's election.
There were three main candidates out of the 8 that were remaining at the end of March that are more likely to win. Ashraf Ghani, we have Abdullah, and Zami Rasul. Can you tell us who they are and what they stand for?
Yeah, all three of these men, I think, would make superb presidents. As a Western observer, we strive strongly not to back or endorse a particular candidate, but to back the process itself. And I think this case, observing the Western interests there, I think the Western governments, and in particular the United States, did a very, very good job of endorsing the process without endorsing a candidate. But as I said, I think any one of these three gentlemen would make a fine president. Abdullah, former foreign minister, has great representation from the North, but also has built a platform of inclusivity, of trying to bring if not a coalition, at least an inclusive government to Kabul. Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai is a former finance minister, a technocrat with extremely good experience with the World Bank, was the finance minister in the very early days of the transitional government and the first administration starting in 2002, and almost single-handedly and with a single-minded purpose restructured the Afghan finance community, brought a single currency to the country, did things that many thought would have to take decades to do, and he did it in a very short period of time. Zalmay Rasul, former foreign minister, former national security advisor, very close to President Karzai, well known to the international community, would also bring a good approach to the palace. So I think in the case of the three front-runners, we would see some continuity in administration, but also a willingness to embrace a very inclusive, very representative cabinet and government from inside the palace.
And how do you envisage the political future of Afghanistan, and especially in regards to NATO troops that still remain in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the Saturday's election, and I would anticipate that if the election goes to a second round, which it likely will, that both of these events should serve as a very stark reminder to the West that Afghanistan remains a country which we should be very willing to stay engaged with. In fact, I think that this election will underscore the willingness of the Afghans to stay engaged with the West in the form of willingness professed by all the leading candidates to sign the bilateral security agreement with the United States, but also a recognition by all the main candidates that they will be highly dependent upon continued financial support from the West, and in essence asking the West to live up to our obligations as professed at the Tokyo conference, the London conference, the conference in Chicago, where the West has had pledged a certain degree of financial support. So I think that there is a strong likelihood that the candidates, if President Karzai doesn't sign it even sooner than that, and he's indicated that he might, that the BSA will be signed sooner rather than later, but that there will be an expectation out of necessity that a level of financial support, particularly for the continued financing of the Afghan National Security Forces, is maintained over the years. We will most definitely see a shift from combat operations, we already have, from combat operations to a training and advising role for any foreign forces that remain in the country. And that will be necessary, I think, to administer this additional assistance and aid that the West will be providing. I think it's also interesting to think for just a moment about the potential role for President Karzai. I personally believe that President Karzai is delighted with the election happening on Saturday. And despite much of the rumors about him wanting to retain power, etc., I think that he would be very happy to see his administration transfer peaceably and peacefully to a new president. And that as a result, he can then move into a senior mentor, elder statesman role. I do not believe that he wants to be manipulating power or the silent partner sort of behind the screen. I think he's ready to see his country move in one big, bold step forward. And I think he'll play a very, very positive role as an elder statesman and a senior mentor to whoever the next president is, whether it's Abdullah Abdullah, Ashraf Ghani, or Zalmay Rasool.
Mr. John Wood, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.